Hey guys, in this module, we're going to be learning all about CSS Grid, the CSS tool that's going to make it easier for us to create two-dimensional layouts. After learning about Flexbox, you would probably look at a layout like this and think that you could have a horizontal row-based Flexbox system with multiple divs inside, and you can define their widths and also their alignment and so on and so forth. Now, how about a layout like this? Can you think of how to create this using Flexbox? It would be pretty hard, right? Well, you'll be relieved to hear that it's not just you. Web designers thought creating these kind of complex layouts is pretty difficult too, which is why they created Grid. And Grid is here to make our lives a lot easier. So if we look at this Swiss website, where they've got the weather forecast for Bern, you can see that it's actually created using Grid. And we can divide up the layout to see what the grid actually looks like. You've got all of these different sections, and you can imagine just how hard this would be to make using just Flexbox or floats. And on top of that, look at how beautifully responsive this website is. It shrinks and preserves the grid format, and everything is more or less proportional depending on how the designer wanted it to look. At this point, you might be wondering, well, what exactly is the difference between Flexbox and Grid then? Do I just pick one of them, or is one of them better than the other one? Well, here's how I tend to think of Flexbox. I tend to think of it as a tool that helps me align content along a one-dimensional line. So this is a horizontal Flexbox, and it's really easy to use it to place our items and define how we want them aligned on our page. Now with Grid, however, on the other end, I think of it as a tool for laying out content along a two-dimensional grid. So maybe I would want a navbar over to the right, maybe I would want some content over here, maybe I'd want a footer down here. Depending on how my design looks, if it is in a 2D, so there's an X and a Y, then in most cases you're going to be better off using Grid. Generally, Flexbox is really great for one-dimensional alignment, and Grid is really good for 2D layouts where you have almost like a table structure with columns and rows. But that makes it sound like as if you're going to be choosing between one of these. It's either going to be Flexbox or Grid. And some of you might be wondering, well, why did you teach us Flexbox anyways? It seems like Grid is far more powerful. If I can do things in 2D, it's obviously better than 1D, right? Why did I bother learning Flexbox? Well, in reality, these tools have different strengths and they have different weaknesses. Most web developers would use a combination of these two tools alongside other things such as floats or bootstraps or other frameworks in order to create their design. In this case, you can see we've got a grid style 2D layout, but within the grid, one of these containers is actually laid out using Flexbox. This is really common. Even in that example I showed you earlier, where I said this is a really beautiful example of grid in action, you can see that actually there are components of Flexbox in this. For example, this is a Flexbox. It's laid out in a Flexbox column, and it's a really good way of setting the alignment for each of these items. So this column-based Flexbox is sitting within this grid. So sometimes you might have a Flexbox inside a grid, and other times you might have a grid inside a Flexbox. So it really just depends on what it is that you want to create, and knowing how to use different tool sets gives you the flexibility to create things exactly the way you want it to. And as my granddad says, the only thing that doesn't weigh you on your travels in life are skills. So the more skills we have, the better we'll be able to adapt to situations and the easier things will be. In order for you to better compare Grid versus Flexbox, because I know right now it seems a little bit abstract, this idea, I created a website to demo the two of them side by side. If you head over to appbury.github.io/grid versus Flexbox, then you can see this example that I've created for you. Just because I said grid is for two-dimensional layouts and Flexbox is for one-dimensional layouts, it doesn't mean that you can't create a one-dimensional grid, but it does behave a little bit differently. Let's take a look at this grid we've got, and I want you to watch how it behaves when I try to make this page smaller. Notice how grid's natural inclination is to create a grid, and everything lines up with each other on a column and row basis. So we have a column here and we have a row right here. And notice how the gaps between all the items pretty much all match up with each other. They're completely straight along a very nice grid. Now, Flexbox behaves very differently. It's actually very difficult to get the Flexbox items to line up with each other like this because it's flexible, right? It tries to actually adapt and squish the content so that everything gets placed on the screen. As I expand this, maybe occasionally some items will line up with each other, kind of like this, but it's not perfect alignment, right? Depending on the kind of behavior you want your items to have, do you want them to prioritize spacing out content and aligning content, or do you want everything to be boxy like a grid? Have a play around with this website and see what other things you can spot that are different between grid and Flexbox. Now that we've seen how grid behaves, it's time to show you how to create an actual grid. Here I've got a div that contains 4 paragraph elements. Now these 4 paragraph elements are going to be my grid items. And on the outside of these items, I've got a container which is going to act as my grid. In order to style this HTML so that it looks like this, all I have to do is target my container using the container class and then set the display to grid. Now this should be familiar to you because previously in order to use Flexbox, we had to set the display to flex. In this case, we're using grid, so we set it to grid. Next, I have to create some grid template columns and some grid template rows. Now we're going to go into this notation in a lot more detail in the coming lessons, but it's also pretty easy to understand. What I'm doing here is I'm saying I want to create columns that have a fractional ratio of 1 to 2. This side should be 1. So the first column, if it had a width of 1, then I want the second column to be twice that width. If this was 100 pixels wide, then this would be 200 pixels wide. But then for my rows, I've said I want it to be 1 to 1, 2 equal fractions. And that's exactly what I get. I get 2 rows that are pretty much equal in their heights. And then finally, I've defined a gap of 10 pixels so that this little distance between the columns and between the rows is 10 pixels. And that allows my paragraphs to separate from each other without any sort of margin or padding. Just using these few lines of code, I've managed to create a relatively complex layout for my website. Let's go ahead and try this and write some code ourselves to see what happens when we set something to display grid. Go ahead and download the starting code for this exercise 10.0 display grid. And if you take a look inside index.html, you'll see that there are a whole bunch of divs that I've created for you. Now, the goal that we're trying to achieve here is to create a chessboard. And as you can imagine, if you had to do this using Float or Flexbox, it's a little bit painful, especially if you wanted each of these divs to line up perfectly with each other. But as we know, this is the strong suit of grid. Using the index.html and what you've learned about CSS Grid, see if you can style this container to set it to use grid and create this kind of outcome. There's a couple of things to note. Each of the squares, white or black, should be 100 pixels by 100 pixels, so they're squares. And I've chosen some colors for a more modern, I guess, sort of chessboard. You can just make that white and black if you want to. It's totally up to you. But the outcome is to create something like this using our index.html, and you should write your code just below the comments here. Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, hopefully you've given that a go, and let's run through the solution together. Now, the first thing we want to do is to open up our preview so that we can see what's happening as we're doing things. And because everything is invisible, because our divs have no size and they have no color, let's fix that first. So if I go ahead and target all of the white squares and set them to have a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels, then if I go ahead and give them a background color, so let's use the one that I've got in the example, then they should hopefully show up. They're a huge stack, kind of just stacked along here, but we won't worry about that too much right now. Let's go ahead and do the same for our black squares to give them a size and to give them a background color. And I'm going to use this color I've defined here. Now we've got our white and black squares. Now, unfortunately, they're all along one line at the moment because this is, remember, the default layout of HTMLflow. All divs are set as display block, so they're going to try and occupy the full width of the screen. And even though we've defined the width and the height, they're not going to come up and sit next to each other unless we add some more CSS, which is exactly what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to target the container that contains all of these divs, and I'm going to set it to display grid. Now, this is not going to do too much just yet because we need to define our template rows and our template columns. If you look at the goal example, you'll see that a chessboard is made up of 8 by 8 squares. You can count these if you want. And in total, there are 64 squares and there are 64 divs that I've already included in the starting code. So we don't have to worry about the HTML. We just have to set up our grid. Let's go ahead and set our grid template columns. So we know we need 8 equal size columns. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And once we created all the columns, then you can see, even if we didn't create any rows, we've already got ourselves a bit of a chessboard that's created. Now we're going to explain why Grid is able to automatically infer what we want. But just in case you did this and it's totally fine, we can add in the grid template rows just so that it's really clear what it is that we want. 8 equal size columns and 8 equal size rows. One thing you might notice with our solution is if you had extra width, then there's all these gaps that show up between each of our columns. Well, the reason for this is because our container is trying to take up the full width of the screen. What we can do is we can set the width to 800 pixels to fit all of our items, and then this way we actually get a compact chessboard that doesn't split up because it's trying to be responsive. Now, the default behavior for a grid container is to try and take up the full width, but only have as much height as it allows to fit the content, so we don't have to change the height. Now, don't worry too much if you didn't set the width. It doesn't matter because this exercise is all about you being able to figure out how to use the grid template columns and how to set the display to grid so that we can turn our divs into our chessboard. As long as you've achieved that, then I'm happy that you've passed this challenge. Now let's head over to the next lesson where we learn more about how to customize our grid. Now, one of the most important things to figure out using grid is how to size our columns and rows to conform to our design. If we start out with a grid container that has 4 grid items like this, and we go ahead and add some CSS. So we create some template rows and template columns. And in this case, we're defining the rows and columns by giving them fixed sizes. 100 pixel and 200 pixel rows, 400 and 800 pixel columns. So when we run this code, this is what we will end up with. We have 100 pixel high for the first row and 200 pixel high for the second row. For the first column, we said it would be 400, and the second column should be twice as wide at 800. The thing you have to realize about the fixed size grids like this one is they are not responsive. That means that if you go ahead and change the width or the height, it's not going to change at all. It's going to stay fixed to these sizes that you have specified. In addition to using pixels, we can also use rem. So you could use the 1 rem and then maybe 2 rem. Now this is still fixed because the rem sizing, as we learned in previous lessons, is relative to the root of your HTML. If your body has a certain size or your HTML has a certain size specified and you change that size, then the rem size will go up and down with it. But this does not make it responsive to the screen size. Now, another way you might see this being represented is instead of having grid template rows and grid template columns, is you can combine the two of these into one property, which is just called grid template. And you define all of your rows first, and then you add a /, and then you define your columns. So if you had a lot of grids to define, if you had a lot of things and you wanted this shorthand, this is how you would do it. I don't recommend us to write code like this at this stage, because I think it's much better when you're learning for everything to be more explicit, so that when you're reviewing your code and you're trying to spot problems, it's much easier when you've got the rows defined and your columns defined and you can see exactly what's going wrong. This just makes it a little bit more hidden as to what's going on, but it's really important for you to know this if you see it in the wild in other people's code, so you know what's going on. Another way that we can define our grid template rows and columns is to use this auto keyword. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to give us a little bit of responsiveness. Each row is going to try and fit to 100% of the horizontal available space. If this was your browser window, maybe it would look something like this. And then you've got your window size like this, then your grid is automatically going to try and take up 100% of that width. So now if you go ahead and define your first column as 200 pixels wide, like what we have here, and then you said the next column should be auto, what this means is the second column is going to be extensible. It can be as wide or as narrow as it needs in order to take up 100% of the width. Now be careful here, because if you do the same thing with the rows, it doesn't behave like what you might think it does. It doesn't try to take up 100% of your screen's height. Instead, what it does is it tries to fit to the content. If this is set, in this case it's 100 pixels, then that div is 100 pixels. Now this one, however, is not set in height, and it's just given to be auto. Now what that's going to do is it's just going to try and fit whatever content is in there. And in this case is this number 3. So as long as number 3 fits in there perfectly, then it will automatically adjust the height to fit that. So just be aware that when you use auto on a row, it's going to fit content. And when you use auto on a column, then it's going to try and go to 100%. This is another case where it's quite good to play around with an actual example. So I've created a demo website for you at appbaroo.github.io/grid sizing. And here we've got a menu of different ways of sizing grid. You've seen the fixed size, where the grid is not responsive at all to the size of the screen. It doesn't matter how wide or how narrow it is. And then we've got the auto size that I showed you just now. This first column, as we said, has to be 200 pixels wide, but then the second column is set to auto. So it's shrinking as I'm shrinking my screen, and it's expanding as I expand my screen. But even though the second row is also set to auto, it only is high enough to fit the content, and it doesn't grow and shrink with the size of the screen. So have a play around with that and come back and we'll talk more about the next one, which is fractional sizing. Frequently, what you might want in your layout is to define the different areas of your layout with ratios for sizes. Maybe you would want the first row to be half the size of the second row, and maybe you would want your columns in the same way. This is where the fractional unit comes in with the FR, and this unit basically defines the ratios. If we run this code, this is what we would get. This first row is half the size of the second row, and similarly, this first column is half the size of the second column. You can of course go for any sort of fractions you want. You could have the first row be 1 FR and the second one be 2.5 FR, or you could have the first column be 3 FR and the second one be 5 FR, any sort of ratios you want essentially. And what it's going to do is it's going to grow and shrink depending on the width available for the horizontal and also the content size for the vertical. Again, going back to our demo, if you take a look at the fractional size, you can see that no matter how much I shrink my screen, the first column is always going to try and stay half the size of the second column. And if I go ahead and select this and then inspect, and I add a whole bunch of content to this bit of HTML, so let's say instead of 3, I just add a whole bunch of text like this, then you can see that the first row expands as well, and it's all done just so that we maintain that fractional ratio, so that this one is always half the size of this one. So have a play around with this example, and then we'll talk about the min-max size. Sometimes you want to define how your grid is responsive, especially on the horizontal. One of the functions we can use is called min-max. And here we can define the minimum width and the maximum width we want our column to be. This is what it might look like. In this case, what we're saying is that when we have enough space on the horizontal, we want to give this second column more space. So it can go all the way up to 800 pixels and all the way down to 400 pixels wide. And this essentially sets a limit, because sometimes we have certain types of content. We don't want it to be too narrow, like an image, or we don't want it to be too wide because it might change the scaling. So this is another way of limiting the size of columns inside your grid. Right now, you can see that this second column here is 800 pixels wide from edge to edge. If I go ahead and reduce the size of this, so if I go ahead and make this window a little bit smaller, you'll see that second column being responsive, reducing in size until it will refuse. And that is because it's hit 400 pixels right here. We're essentially setting a stop at 400 pixels and another at 800 pixels to further define how we want our website to be responsive. Remember previously when we created our chessboard, we had to write 1FR, 1FR, 1FR 8 times, and that's a lot of repetition. And remember, we're programmers, so we're inherently lazy and we want to save ourselves work. We can do that in Grid by using the repeat function. So we're saying repeat this size this many times. This is how many times you want to repeat it, and this is the size. And similarly with our columns, we can do the same thing. What this is equivalent to is defining the rows as 200 pixels, space 200 pixels, and for our columns, this code is the same as saying 100 pixels, space 100 pixels. But we didn't have to write all of that out. And as you can imagine, if the repeat was 8 or 10 or 100, that's going to save you a lot of time. And as you would expect, this would create exactly the same layout as if you had defined the size of each column and each row. It works exactly the same, it's just time saving. Now, what if you defined a grid that is larger than you have items for? So here you can see in our HTML, we have 4 items, but here we're creating a 2x3 grid. So we have 2 rows and 3 columns. If we only have 4 items, they're fitted into our grid from the top left all the way to the bottom right. So that means once we've laid out the first row, it's going to double back and continue along the second row. But if we don't have any items for number 5 and number 6, then it's just not going to add them in there, and you have this style of layout. Now, what happens if you don't define enough rows and columns? So in this case, we're defining a 2x2 grid with each item being 200 pixels tall and wide. Now, I've added in a third div, item number 5. Because that doesn't fit within the templated row and column, which is only 2x2, so this is the defined template grid, well then anything that gets added afterwards will get an automatic size based on its height and also any existing column sizes. So it will try to match the previous column's width, but it will try to fit the height to the height of the content. If you want to change this, let's say you have some code that will create more divs in the future, or maybe you have a game that's going to add more squares, something like that, you can actually use the grid auto rows and grid auto columns to define this. So in this case, I'm saying when we create a new row that doesn't fit within our grid, because our grid actually ends here, then give each of them 300 pixels in height. And this just allows you to control your styling no matter how many items gets added to the grid. This is a good time to go back to our demo and click on the repeat title to see our repeated grid. As you might imagine, this is a very simple grid which is repeated by having 2 rows that are 200 pixels each and 2 columns which are 100 pixels each. If I go ahead and change this so that I have 3 columns, then you can see we have that layout we had before where we've got some missing items, but it's only going to lay out as many items as we have in our HTML. Similarly, if I change this to only 1 column, then we've got some extra items that are not defined using our template rows and columns, which is a 2x1, so 2 rows, 1 column, and all these extra ones get an automatic size based on the size of their content. But we can of course change this by using that property we learned, which is grid auto rows, And if we set this to be, say, 300 pixels, then you can see every new automatically added item gets that particular height. Have a play around with this, and once you're done, I want you to come back and I want to talk more about how we can use the Chrome developer tools to investigate and debug our CSS grid. As you can imagine, as we're fiddling around with Flexbox or Grid, it can be quite hard to know exactly what's happening behind the scenes. So we're going to learn more about how we can use the Chrome developer tools to see exactly what's going on in our CSS grid. As you remember, you can bring up the Chrome developer tools either by right-click to go to Inspect, or simply to go to the three dots, go to More Tools, and then go to Developer Tools. It will do exactly the same thing, basically bring up this panel. One of the cool things that you'll see is when you have defined a grid, so this is when you set display grid onto a particular item in your HTML. In the Chrome developer tools, you see this little chip show up and it says grid. If you click on it, it will offer you a whole bunch of information, which is really handy. Now we can change the layout of the overlaid stuff by going into layout here. And you can see, for example, if I don't want to have a pink sort of outline, let me change this to black, then you can see it maybe a little bit more clearly. I can also change whether if we show each of the sizes of the columns and the rows, or if I want to extend the grid lines to see what's happening, or if I want to show the line numbers. I can basically show and hide all of these things. But normally by default, you'll see the line numbers and you'll see the sizes of the rows and the columns. Here, if we look at the first number, you can see that each of the columns are 100 pixels wide. And if we look at the first number for the second part, each of the rows are 200 pixels high. So now that we've learned how to size items in our CSS grid and use the Chrome developer tools to inspect and see exactly what's going on with our sizing, it's time for us to try an exercise. So I've created a grid sizing exercise in the website. And to access it, all you have to do is go back to the main menu of the grid sizing website and then go to the test page. You can see this is the grid that we want you to recreate. And I've added in the width and height requirements to most of them. There's just a couple of things to note, which is how this website responds when we resize it. If I go ahead and reduce the width, you can see that the first column will expand to fill the space and reduce until a certain point. Now, when I continue reducing the size, you can see that the third column will also start to reduce in size, but the second column stays that particular fixed size always. The other thing to note is that our final item here is only 50 pixels high, and it's actually even shorter than how much it should be allocated based on the content. So this is a grid item that's put in automatically. So now if you scroll down, you'll see the area that you're working with. And right now it's just a div without any styling. I want you to go ahead and write your CSS code below. Only write code that is going to target the grid container, which is this gray box around all of our grid items. And I want your code to make this purple section exactly the same as the green section and also responsive in exactly the same way. Pause the video, have a think about this problem, write your code, and then click Apply CSS to see it applied and make sure to see that you've got the right code working. Pause the video now and give that a go. All right, so the first thing we need to do in order to create a grid is, of course, set our display to grid, which is not going to do very much to our code because we need to set the template. So we're going to use our grid template rows. Now, how should our rows look? Well, if we look at this first row, it seems to be as high as is required to fit the content. And similar with the second one, they're exactly the same height, but the third one seems to be double the size of these two. So we can use our fractional units with 1FR, 1FR, and 2FR to define our rows. Notice the third one is completely different from any of the other ones. If we look at the last row, you can see it's only 50 pixels high. So we could, if we wanted to define it right here as a fourth row. But I'm actually going to leave it because I'm going to use the grid auto rows to set the height for that last one instead. Let's go ahead and apply our CSS and see what happens. First row is 1FR, second row is 1FR, third row is twice as high. Now, what about all of these other ones? Well, we need them to become columns. So let's define our grid template columns. And it's really important that we don't make any typos here because otherwise our code is not going to work. If you have any strange errors or anything that's not working, I want you to make sure that you check the spelling of each of these grid template rows. Remember, there's an S at the end, and grid template columns. Make sure that you haven't spelled anything wrong because that happens a lot, and that's a really simple way to fix your problems. So how do we want our columns to be laid out? Well, this first one is going to expand to fill any available space. And even when it's hit the size of the content, it will continue to reduce until the minimum size. This is actually done using our auto value. So this is going to expand to fill any available space and shrink until it can no longer shrink. The second column is easy. It's a fixed 400 pixel wide column. And the final one has a minimum and maximum value, so it can be defined using our min-max function. Minimum 200 pixels and maximum 500 pixels. Let's create our three columns down here. Auto, 400 pixels, and then min-max, 200 and 500. Let's apply our CSS and we can see our purple ones are now looking pretty much the same as our green ones. And when we try to expand and contract our grid, you can see that it behaves exactly the same way in terms of responsiveness. For the final row, it's being put in with the height that is enough to fit its content. But remember, we learned about this concept of the grid auto row. So we could use grid auto rows. So again, we have an S at the end to define how high each new automatically created row that is outside of the template should be. So we can change that to 50 pixels. And when we apply that CSS, you can see that this, which is outside our template grid, gets added in with 50 pixels of height. Hopefully you managed to do this. If you didn't, go back and check to see if you have made any typos, any spelling mistakes, and with what we've spoken about in the solution, see if you can fix your code. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson where we're going to learn more about how to place items inside a CSS grid. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. In the previous lesson, we looked at how to create our grids and how to size them. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to lay out items in the grid that we've created and how to place them in the areas that we want. Previously, we saw this layout when we said this is a really great layout to use CSS Grid to create. So let's use CSS Grid to create this layout by learning about how we place items in our grid. But before we do that, it's really important to define some of the terms that are used often in CSS Grid. The first thing, if you remember, is we created a container that contains all of the items. And this is usually a div, and it's called the grid container. The items that are placed inside the grid are, as you would expect, called grid items. And when we create and size our grid, we create these rows and we create these columns. Now these are collectively known as tracks. We have our row tracks and we have our column tracks. And we usually create and size these tracks using grid template rows or grid template columns. Within the intersections of the tracks, we create these small units, which are called a grid cell. They are the smallest unit in a grid, and they can be different sizes. So this one, for example, is a little bit wider than this one, but they essentially sit between the columns and the rows. You can use multiple cells to create a grid item. For example, in this case, we've actually positioned our grid item across two of our grid cells, this one and this one. And here we've created a grid item that is positioned vertically onto two of our grid cells. And then the final piece of the puzzle are the lines that separate our tracks. We have horizontal lines and we have vertical lines, and these are called the grid lines because they are essentially the grid lines. And we can only control the grid lines by using that gap property to specify its height or width. But we can't really change its color. We can't really put anything inside the lines. They are just that. They are lines for layout. With all of those things combined together in grid, we've got our lines, we've got our tracks, we've got our cells, we've got our container, and we've got our items. These are some of the most common words that you'll hear me say when we talk about grid, and especially when we're thinking about placement. It's all of these things combined together that allow us to create these layouts using our grid. Let's try and create that layout using actual code. I've created a grid container, and inside I've placed 3 grid items by creating 3 divs. Now I'm going to update the CSS code for that grid container, make it use grid by setting display to grid. In addition, I'm setting the height to 100 viewport height. Remember that by default, a div is going to span the entire width of the window, but it's only going to occupy as much vertical space as there is content. But by setting the height of our container to 100 viewport height, then it's also going to take that container and make it stretch all the way down to the bottom of the window. So now that we've got our grid container, we can create our tracks. And the tracks, if you remember, are created using the grid template properties. We're saying that there should be 3 columns. The first 2 are about the same height as each other, and the third one is a little bit wider. And then we've said that there should be 2 rows of equal height. So something like this would get created. So we've got our tracks, we've got our lines, we've got our container. Now the items get placed in by default. It will start from the first and it will go into each of the cells that are available. This cowboy will go into here. The next one, the astronaut, will go into here, and the book will take up the final cell. This is before we've specified any sort of positioning. And the final thing that we've updated here is the gap. We've said that there should be a 3 rem gap. We're saying that each of these lines should be 3 rem thick. And that means that we don't have to use padding or margin to separate the items in our grid. And when we run all of this code, this is what we will see. You'll notice the 3 rem gap between each of the grid items. You'll notice the ratio of the width of our column, 1 to 1 to 1.5. But you'll also notice that there's actually a whole track down here that's unoccupied. Because as I mentioned, by default, our grid is going to lay out our items into the unoccupied cells, 1 item per cell. Before we change that and create that layout in the beginning, I have a small challenge for you. Wouldn't it be nice if the content of each of these item divs were actually centered properly, like this? And in order to do this, we're going to revise what you've learned about Flexbox. Remember what I said about how Flexbox is something that you're going to use with Grid. Grid doesn't replace Flexbox, and Flexbox is great for aligning items in our layouts. Go ahead and download the starting code, which is a zipped file called 10.2 grid placement, extract it, and open it up inside VS Code. If we go ahead and show the preview, you'll see our 3 grid items, and I've made the emojis a little bit bigger to make it easier to see. Now, your goal is to make this website look like this, with each of the emojis horizontally and vertically centered in our div. And you're going to do that using Flexbox. So have a think about how you can do this, and if you need to, go back to the previous module in Flexbox, look at Flexbox layout and see if you can figure this out. Pause the video and complete this challenge. All right, so the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to turn each of these divs into a Flexbox container, and we'll do that by setting display to flex. Now, once we've done that, the next step is to use the justify content to set our content into the center. And justify content, if you remember, is along the main axis of our Flexbox. So when we said that this should be display flex, we've essentially created a row-based Flexbox with just a single item in it. And we told it to justify itself into the center horizontally. The next thing we need to do is to move this down to the vertical center. And we can do that using the align items property. Let's set that to center, and you can see how easily we've managed to center each of our text items inside our div just by using Flexbox. Flexbox provides one of the easiest ways to center an item inside another container. And if we were doing this with floats or CSS or absolute positioning, it will be a nightmare, especially when you want to change things and adapt your layout. But as you can see, Flexbox working alongside Grid is super useful and makes it easy for us to create any sort of layout that we desire. These tools together work beautifully. Hopefully you've managed to do that and you've got your emojis centered in the middle of the divs. The next step is to try and create this layout that we said should be really easy and doable using Grid. Let's go ahead and lay out this first item, this cowboy emoji. In order to do that, I'm going to set it apart from the other divs by giving it a blue background color. And then I'm going to set a property called grid column, and I'm going to set the value to span to. Let's see what this does first of all. Now, you might remember this layout comes from our Chrome developer tool, and we can switch it on in order to see the lines and the tracks in our grid. When I selected the cowboy div, this very first div, and I set it to span 2 columns, essentially what happens is it's going from track number 1 all the way to track number 3, and it's bridging these 2 columns. And that's what span 2 columns does. So it starts at the position where that div is supposed to be, and this is the end result. If you take a look inside the folder of the previous exercise, you'll see that we provided the code for this demo. Now, I'm a big believer in learning programming by playing around with code. So I recommend going into the demo1.html, seeing the code that we've added, and then go ahead and click on Show Preview, and we can view this layout in our browser. Now, if you right-click on that div that we just laid out, you can see the grid by clicking on that grid chip, and you'll see these lines show up. Now you can change the line color by selecting this box, and we can make it a little bit darker to make it easier to see. Now, the other part that's really helpful about the Chrome Developer Tool is it actually shows you the line numbers. So you can see that the first one is line number 1, the second line is line number 2, line number 3, and line number 4. And this is really useful because there's another way of positioning our items. If we go into our styles and select our first div, you can see we've set the grid column to span 2. But if you notice, there's a little triangle next to that property, and when you click on it, you can see that it's actually a shorthand property for 2 other properties, where that item should start in the grid column and where that item should end in the grid column. Let's switch this off and actually add in those 2 properties. So let's set the grid column start. Let's say instead of the default where it starts at where it would be placed normally in the first cell, let's tell it to start from the second line. So now you can see that div move over to start here. And if we go ahead and specify the next property, which is grid column end, then we can say maybe it should end at 4. So now it's positioned starting from column number 2, ending at column number 4. Another way to specify the last line in a grid is to use these negative values. So if you look at the bottom, you can see all the negative values specified for each line. So if we count from the right hand side, then this line is -1, this is -2, -3, and -4. Let's say the grid column should end at -1, then it's going to extend to this last line. And this -1 is really, really handy because if you had many columns and you're not quite sure how many columns there are because maybe you created the grid dynamically or using code and it extends itself automatically or something crazy like that, you can always use -1 to specify the right-handmost line in the grid, and you can always use the positive number 1 to specify the leftmost line in the grid. These are just some really handy tips. Now, in addition to -1, you can see there's also -2 and -3, but I don't recommend using these because it very quickly gets confusing when you look at this at a glance. So I only recommend using -1 or maybe -2 if you really want to stretch it, and using the positive numbers the rest of the time. Another thing to note here is you can actually start and end whichever direction you want. So let's say that I wanted my grid column to end from the second line, and I set my start to line number 4. Then it's going to flip that and still take up these 2 columns. It doesn't actually matter whether if your start is to the left of your end or if your end is to the left of your start. And you can even change this to span 2 and change the end to auto, which is the automatically initial position of the div before you did any positioning. So in this case, it should be the first line. And if we go ahead and expand our original grid column span 2, the shorthand is exactly the same as what we've done here. It's important to remember that the grid column property is actually short for 2 other properties. And we could set each of these properties separately, or we can set it by using grid column. And grid column span and then a particular number, for example, span 2, is basically telling our grid item to start where it's meant to start and then span as many columns as we specify right here. Now, as you can imagine, there is a corresponding property called grid row, which allows you to set the grid row start and the grid row end so that you can say how many of these vertical cells you want your grid item to span. So now that we've seen how we can occupy more than one cell in our grid and position it based on the start and end line numbers. To achieve this first part of the layout, the next step is to lay out this green div. It might be a little bit more tricky than you would expect, because this second div, if we look at the HTML, should be positioned immediately after this cowboy div. If in this default setup, we go ahead and set this to also span to using grid column, then in that case, it's actually just going to stay right here because there are no more columns left. And by default, it's going to start right after the previous div from here. Then this is the layout that we're going to end up with. So one way we can fix this is by using another property called order. Similar to Flexbox, each of the grid items inside a grid container by default have a order of 0. They're all 0, so they're all equal. If we elevate or promote the order of one item, so if this one becomes 1 and these are all by default 0, then that means this 1 is going to be the rightmost or the bottommost in that grid. So now this gets shifted all the way to the end, and it's as if we've placed this div down here. It doesn't really matter if you set the order to 1 or 100, it's all relative. If everything else is 0, as long as it's greater than 0, it's going to go to the end of the grid. But if you, for example, had maybe a order of 2 and then this one had a order of 5, then this one has to be greater than 5 in order to go into this position. And the direction goes from left to right and then top to bottom in this way. Now that we've learned how we can make this item have a higher order than the other items, and we've positioned it now into this bottom cell, it's time for you to do the next exercise, which is make it occupy 2 horizontal cells to be positioned directly under the blue div to look something like this. Open up exercise number 2 and go ahead and show it as the preview. Then update the code for the astronaut div so that it looks like this image, goal 2. Pause the video and complete this challenge. All right, so let's make the astronaut box look like the one in goal number 2. We've already changed the order and we've moved it from here, which is its default positioning based on the HTML, to here by making it a higher order number than anything else. Now, all we have to do is use that property we learned about previously, grid column, and we can make it span to in order to take up 2 of the columns inside our grid. So now it's positioned directly under our previous blue div, and we're getting one step closer to that layout that we were looking for. Now, some of you might have realized that there's actually another way that you could create this positioning, which is instead of using the order property to change the order of that green astronaut div, we could actually simply just define all of its positions. So we could say that it should start column-wise at column number 1, and it should end column-wise at column number 3. And then we could use the grid row to say that it should start at row number 2, and it should end at row number 3. So now we've basically given it the exact coordinates for how to position this grid item, and it will go in there even if we don't change the order. As you can imagine, there's probably also a shorthand for these 4 properties. And instead of writing each of these out individually, which is a lot of typing, we can just use the single shorthand property of grid area to specify it. Now, the order is important. We have to add 4 values separated by forward slashes, and the first value corresponds to the grid row start. This is number 1, which is 2 and 2, as you can see. The second one is the grid column start, right here. And the third one is the grid row end. And the last one is the grid column end. And this creates a 4-coordinate layout that pens in our grid item. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind when you're using grid area is if you're going to use grid area on a particular item, for example, this one, if you want the rest of the layout to behave as expected, they all need to use grid area. Now that we've seen how we can lay out the items using grid column or grid row and adding a span for how many columns or rows it should span, we've seen how we can use grid area or the order property to position items as well. It's time to figure out how we can position this and to test you in an exercise. The goal is to add some code into this book div to make this layout look like the goal 3 image, making that orange div occupy the entire 2 vertical rows. And you're going to do this using the grid row property. Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so as we mentioned when we talked about grid column, there is the corresponding grid row. We can change the grid row so that it spans 2 rows. We write span 2, and then it's going to take up the 2 rows. And now we have our layout that we wanted. Now, you might have done this differently using grid area. So we could have started the area from row number 1 all the way until row number 3 or row -1, which is to the end, and start at column number 3 and end at column number 4, or also the last column. We could have done it like this. So there's multiple ways of doing this, but I think this is probably the most straightforward. Take a look at solution number 3 to see if one of your solutions matches. The final thing I want to show you is one of the biggest differences between Grid and Flexbox is Grid actually lets you overlay items onto other items. Notice how in this case, you can see this orange box is actually sitting on top of the green and blue boxes. And we can do this by simply positioning items on top of each other in the grid. The code for this might look something like this. Notice firstly, I've given this book div a transparency of 80. So when we're using hex codes, the first 6 characters correspond to the color, so the amount of red, green, and blue. And then finally, we can add a value for what's called alpha, which is just how much transparency there is. 80 basically is about 50% transparency. That allows us to see through the orange at the blue and the green. Once we've done that, and I've laid out the grid area so that it actually overlaps. So here we're starting at row number 1 and column number 2, and then we're continuing until row number 3 and column number 4. Then we have this large area defined, which actually overlaps the first div and also the second div. Simply by positioning this book element on top of the other 2, we've actually created an overlapping layout. And this is one of the coolest things about Grid, where it has flexible positioning and it's really easy to put things on top of each other, around each other, line things up straight. And as you'll see, it's just really, really helpful for creating complex layouts. Now that we've completed our tutorial, it's time for you to try an exercise. And similar to Flexbox Froggy, the creator of Flexbox Frog, Thomas Park, also created a cool game called Grid Garden. If you head over to @brew.github.io/gridgarden, all one word, then you'll be able to see the CSS grid game with all 28 levels. Remember, you can change the language of the instructions here, and you can also go between the different levels, but ideally you should be able to go from 1 all the way straight through to 28. And you'll be able to use what you've learned about CSS Grid to water your garden and poison the weeds. Pause the video, have a go at that now, and once you're done, carry on to the next lesson where we're going to create our final project for this section. Enjoy and see you there. Alright guys, it's time to use what we've learned about CSS Grid to create a masterpiece. I want to introduce you to somebody who loves a CSS Grid probably more than anyone, and that is Pierre Mondrian. He is a Dutch painter who has created masterpieces that you might have seen before. And they look like this one, composition number 3 with red, blue, yellow, and black, which is not a very creative name, but it is a beautiful painting, especially if you're really into grids, which he is. But also, it seems like a lot of other people are, because this piece was auctioned off for a whopping $50.6 million. So I hope you're glad that you started this section and learned about CSS Grid too. Now, I've created a graphic that breaks down all of the dimensions of each of the element in this grid. And I've measured everything up with a ruler so that we can create a realistic to scale version of this painting using CSS Grid. If you want to create a different painting, because he's created lots of these compositions, and you don't want to use my measurements, that's totally cool as well. You can simply Google image search Mondrian compositions, and if you look in the images tab, you'll see a whole bunch of different ones that he created. And you can pick one that you like. There are ones which are super complicated, and there are ones which are really, really simple. But if you're doing it this way, then you'll probably have to judge by eye the sizes of the tracks, for example, the rows and the columns. But remember, this is a project, so it's totally up to you whether if you want to do the version that I've measured up for you, or do a completely separate one, or do both, or make lots and lots of different paintings. It's totally up to you. Go ahead and download the starting files for the Mondrian project. And if you take a look inside the index.html, you'll see that I've added some of the hex codes for the colors in this image. And that way you can actually get a more realistic version of the painting. So everything should be pixel perfect, measured colors, and this is what you would end up with if you followed all of the colors in here and the dimensions in this dimensions.png. Using what you've learned about grid, either use my dimensions and colors to create this final goal website, which you'll notice is actually even centered on screen. So think about how you might do that. Or you can pick one of the other paintings, any of his paintings, and use CSS Grid to see if you can figure out how to recreate it, but in a website. Pause the video now and give this project a go. All right, so the first thing you'll notice is that there's no HTML written for you and there's no CSS. So you're going to have to write everything completely yourself. If we take a look at our solution, you can see that we've created as many divs as there are squares on the painting. If I go ahead and show preview, and I open this up as a website, you'll see this is our final solution code masterpiece, which I actually think looks really, really pleasant. I might just print out a copy and put it on my wall because it is really beautiful. If we look at this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 divs in total. And that's exactly how many I've added into the CSS Grid container. Now, because some of them are different colors, I've added some classes onto them, but most of the layout actually occurs in the container class. I specified a height and width according to the dimensions in the dimensions image, and then set it to display grid. Now, I gave the whole thing a background color because remember I said we can't actually change the color of the lines, but we can create a gap so that the background actually shows up. That's a little trick that I figured out. There's probably other ways of doing this, but hopefully you've seen that hint from me, and if you didn't, maybe you've worked it out yourself. Next, I created the columns and the rows and specified fixed sizes because these dimensions are super crazy. And basically I looked at all of the different columns. So this is column number 1's width, this is column number 2, number 3, and number 4. 4 columns in total because these are actually going to be 2 different items. So I had to split this into 2 columns, and this spans 2 columns and this spans 3 columns. That's how I figured it out. Row wise, we've got 1 row here, another one here, another one here, and finally the last one here. So 4 rows and 4 columns. And then I specified a gap of 9 pixels, which will show up as the black lines. And then I gave everything by default the background color of the white, and each individual item, if they were colored differently, I would give them the colors that they needed. Based on the positioning of some of these, for example, this big white block actually needs to span 3 columns. So these 3 columns. And I use the grid column property to create that look. And then the second white one spans 2 rows vertically because we have these 4 rows. Taking up these 2 is a grid row span 2 job. For the third white cube, I decided to use a grid area because it seemed easier to define, but you might have used something else. And the rest of the solution code should be pretty straightforward. Now, hopefully you managed to achieve this. It's involved a little bit of remembering how we size our grid tracks, how we lay out and position our items in our grid container, and finally, how to center an item inside the middle of the screen using Flexbox. Hopefully you managed to figure out all of these things. If not, be sure to review the relevant pieces of content in this section. And now you should know how to use Flexbox, how to use Grid, and how to use them together in order to create beautiful masterpieces, but also complex web layouts. So hope you had fun in this section, and I'll see you in the next one.